You're standing in front of a painting, not a photograph of it, not a print on someone's wall, the real thing, in the real room, and something happens that you were not prepared for. Your chest tightens, your eyes fill with tears you don't understand. The room tilts slightly. Your heart is beating faster than it should be. You sit down on a bench because your legs have decided they're done. You didn't expect this. It's just a painting. You've seen paintings before, but this one is doing something to you that you cannot explain and cannot stop. This is the Stendhal Effect, and it doesn't just happen in front of paintings. In 1817, a French author named Stendhal visited the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, Italy. He had come to see the frescoes of Giotto. He stood in front of them for a long time, and then, in his own words, he wrote, "I was in a sort of ecstasy. My heart began to beat. Life was draining out of me. I walked in fear of falling." He made it outside. He sat on a bench. It took him an hour to feel like himself again. Stendhal was not a fragile man. He was a soldier who had marched with Napoleon. He had seen things most people never see, and a ceiling fresco in Florence had floored him. He wrote about it in his travel diary and moved on. He didn't think he had discovered anything. He thought he had simply had a moment. It would be 160 years before anyone took that moment seriously. And in 1979, an Italian psychiatrist named Graziella Magherini was working at the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, the city where Stendhal had collapsed on that bench. Over the course of her career, she began noticing something strange in her patient records, a pattern that kept appearing in a very specific type of person: tourists, not locals, not residents. Tourists, almost always first-time visitors to Florence, who were being admitted to hospital with a cluster of symptoms that didn't fit any standard diagnosis. Racing heart, dizziness, confusion, dissociation, panic attacks so severe they needed sedation, and in some cases, genuine temporary psychosis, hallucinations, paranoid episodes, a complete break from reality lasting hours or days. And in almost every case, the symptoms had begun in front of a piece of art. By 1989, Magherini had documented 107 cases. She published a book. She named the condition after the author who had described it first. She called it Stendhal syndrome. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the obvious question is, why Florence? Magherini's cases were almost exclusively tourists in Florence, not Rome, not Paris, not the Louvre, which gets more visitors than almost anywhere on Earth. Florence. And the answer, she argued, wasn't just about the art, it was about the density. Florence is a city of roughly 370,000 people that contains an almost incomprehensible concentration of the world's greatest art in an almost incomprehensibly small space. The Uffizi Gallery alone holds Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Caravaggio, Raphael, Titian, Michelangelo, all within walking distance of each other, all reachable on foot in an afternoon. Magherini's theory was that the collapse wasn't caused by a single work, it was caused by accumulation, days of beauty stacked on top of each other, compressing into a single, overwhelming moment, and the brain finally reaching a threshold it wasn't built to handle. And then there's the expectation layer. The tourists who collapsed weren't casual visitors who wandered in off the street. They were, almost universally, people who had waited their whole lives to see these works, people who had studied them in books for decades, who had built a version of the experience in their imagination for years before arriving, and then the real thing was more than the imagination had prepared them for. But what is actually happening in the brain? Neuroscientists who have studied aesthetic experience, the technical term for what happens when you encounter something beautiful, have found something that most people don't expect. Your brain doesn't have a single beauty center. There isn't one region that lights up and says, "This is beautiful, proceed accordingly." Instead, encountering something genuinely overwhelming activates a cascade across multiple systems simultaneously. The visual cortex processes the image. The limbic system, the emotional core of the brain, responds with the same intensity it reserves for genuine threats or genuine love. The default mode network, the part of your brain that constructs your sense of self, briefly destabilizes, and the autonomic nervous system, the one that controls your heart rate, your breathing, Your blood pressure starts firing as if something important is happening, because something important is happening. And here's the part that reframes everything. That cascade, the racing heart, the dizziness, the tears, the feeling of the room tilting, isn't a malfunction. It isn't your brain breaking down. It's your brain recognizing something it considers significant at a level deeper than conscious thought. The Stendhal Effect isn't weakness. It's the opposite. It's what happens when something is so real, so dense with human intention and human feeling, that your nervous system responds to it the way it would respond to anything genuinely important. Your body doesn't know the difference between standing in front of the birth of Venus and standing in front of something that matters enormously to your survival. It just knows this is significant. Pay attention. Don't move. And it isn't only art. Stendhal syndrome has been documented in front of architecture, in the middle of natural landscapes, at concerts, inside cathedrals, on mountaintops, in the middle of cities encountered for the first time after a lifetime of imagining them. Travelers report it constantly and almost never have a name for it. They described standing in front of the Taj Mahal at sunrise and suddenly being unable to speak, or rounding a corner in Kyoto during cherry blossom season and having to stop walking because something in their chest is too full to move through, or stepping into the Sistine Chapel and looking up and feeling, for reasons they cannot explain to anyone, like they are about to cry. It isn't weakness, it isn't being dramatic, it's the oldest human response there is, to beauty so concentrated it breaks through the part of your brain that is supposed to stay in control. So what have we learned today? Here's what nobody tells you when you travel. You can plan an itinerary, you can book the tickets and read the guidebook and manage the logistics perfectly, but you cannot plan for the Stendhal effect. You cannot schedule the moment when something reaches past all of your defenses and reminds you, without words, without argument, that you are a small creature standing inside something enormous. Magherini, who spent decades studying the people who collapsed in front of art, said something that has stayed with researchers ever since. She said the people most likely to be affected were not the ignorant ones. They were the ones who had prepared the most, who had read the most, who had cared the longest. The more you bring to a work, the more it has to work with, which means the Stendhal effect isn't something that happens to you despite your sensitivity. It happens because of it. So the next time you're standing somewhere extraordinary and your heart starts beating faster than it should, and your eyes fill up for reasons you can't quite explain, and your legs feel like they might not be entirely reliable, don't be embarrassed. Don't talk yourself out of it. You're not malfunctioning. Your nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, responding to something real, something dense, something made by human hands or shaped by geological time. That is, in this moment, more than your brain quietly knows how to hold. That feeling has a name. It's 200 years old. It's the Stendhal effect.